Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another talk from the Scottish Centre of the Royal Meteorological Society. My name is Gary Johnston. I'm the chair of the Scottish Centre, and it's really nice to welcome you again to one of our talks tonight. We're really grateful for you coming along to these. We do have a very healthy turnout, which is really good. And we've got a really interesting talk, as always, again tonight. Just before we start, I just obviously like to encourage people. We do these talks, we do not charge people for the talks. We used to have them in person the last couple of years because of COVID. We'll be doing them virtually, but we would encourage people to join RMET. You don't have to be a meteorologist to join. It's a fascinating subject. There's a lot of benefits to being a member, and you'll find all the details at rmets.org. That's rmets.org. Okay, just before we start and I introduce our speaker tonight, we are using slightly different software tonight than we have done before, but there still is a whiteboard for you to put your questions up on. So that would encourage you as you talk, as the speaker talks, to put any questions up. I would also ask, if you're referring to a particular slide, take a note of the number of the slide or the name of the slide so we can put it back up on the screen if you've got a particular question about something in particular referring to that slide. Just also to let you know that our talks are recorded and they are available on YouTube a few days after, subject to a release of permission being granted by our speakers. If there are any issues with sound or picture, I would encourage you to just log out, refresh your browser and log back in again, but hopefully everything will be okay. Okay, right, on to our speaker for tonight. I'm really pleased to introduce to you Neil Lonnie from the Dundee Satellite Station Ltd. It's something that's been of interest to many of our committee members and a lot of meteorologists and interested parties in Scotland. And Neil is going to give us a history of the Dundee Satellite Receiving Station and the follow-on Dundee Satellite Station Ltd and how that was set up. Now, Neil has a background in electrical and electronic engineering, having graduated with a BSc in honours from the Dundee College of Technology. He was employed by the University of Dundee as station manager for the Dundee Satellite Receiving Station facility from 1988 to 2019. Since then, he's been working along with former colleagues to establish a new ground station. So Neil, welcome, and I'll pass over to you and look forward to your talk.
Okay, thank you very much, Gary. I'll first of all just share my screen so that we can see the display there. Okay, so you should have these slides on screen now. So as Gary says, I was the station manager at the former Dundee Satellite Receiving Station, which operated at the University of Dundee pretty much through from the late 1960s through until 2019. So my slides here, they provide a history of DSRS and the formation of the Dundee Satellite Station ground station following the closure of DSRS in 2019. Okay, so my first slide here is what our staff members would have considered something of an iconic view from one of the station sites. It's actually taken from the University of Dundee Tower building with one of our antennas at the south side of the building and the River Tay and Tay Rail Bridge in the background there. Okay, by way of an introduction, it's a fairly lengthy collection of slides, so I thought I'd just give you an overview of what's to be covered. So firstly, I'll look at the origins of DSRS and its development to becoming a NERC service. The early years of the facilities and operations through the 1970s and 80s. The antennas that we had at that time, the archiving procedures, the satellites we received from products and dissemination of those products. They'll then continue with its evolution through the 1990s and developments through that period, continuing on with further evolution through the 2000s and beyond, right up to the closure in 2019. Also, will give you an overview of data sets that were collected throughout the lifetime of the station and archived, and their geographical coverage. The user community, projects that we supported, and publications, along with media coverage, and then move on to, which will probably be of greatest interest to many of you, some examples of our gallery images and notable images that were collected throughout the many years of operations. I also mention other Dundee built ground stations because it's a thing that not many people may actually appreciate or been aware of, that the systems at the university were actually built in-house, essentially by designed and built by staff. So on the back of that, the station also was invited to provide other ground station facilities, other ground station equipment for other organisations. Beyond that, moving on sadly to the closure of DSRS and its decommissioning, and then on a more optimistic footing, the establishing of DSS Ltd and the setup and development of our new site at Errol airfield in Perthshire. And to close the slides, just an overview of recent developments down at Errol and future plans that we have at this point in time. So as far as activities at the university, just these are the buildings where the station essentially operated from, just to give some context. So the top photograph there is actually the Ewing building. Now that's the building that the station itself, the main station operations area, was hosted in. And that was right through from the 1960s. We were actually on the top floor of that building for most of that time. You can see a kind of porta cabin building there, which was my home for 31 years or so. The bottom image shows you the two main sort of tower buildings that we had our primary operational antennas on over the years. So the one in the foreground is the University Tower building. That was essentially the main admin building for Dundee University. The building to the rear was the dental school, which again is a similar 10-storey high building, and you can just make out in both cases that there are actually antennas on top. They look relatively small. From there, this photograph was taken down essentially on the bank of the River Tay to the south of the university campus. And on the left, we have the same image I posted up on the first slide. So again, looking southwards from the tower building towards the river. And then on the right, again from the tower building looking north, we have the dental building directly behind it, and the Dundee Law for any of those that are reasonably familiar with the Dundee area. Okay, so looking at the origins in early years, the station was operated by the University of Dundee for 40+ years. It was based in the Ewing building, and originally as part of the electrical engineering department, which eventually we, before the station closure, after many changes of structure within the university in different departments, we ended up in the Space Technology Centre, which was part of the School of Computing. The station was founded by Peter Bayliss and Dr. John Brush during the 1960s. And it really developed from academic and student projects in electronics and RF communications. It was established as an operational receiving station in 1976 and funded thereafter by NERC and part of NERC Services and Facilities Group for most of its time. And from the mid-1990s, it was partnered with Plymouth Marine Laboratory and their remote sensing team down there. The NERC Services and Facilities Group funded a range of facilities to support UK environmental researchers. So DSRS over its years became a main UK ground station receiving direct broadcast Earth observation satellite data. From the late 60s, it initially received data from polar orbiting weather satellites transmitting in the VHF range. And L-band reception began in 1975 after building our first dish-based tracking antenna for reception of NOAA VHRR data from polar orbiters. We also received from 1977 L-band digital geostationary satellite data from the Meteosat first generation satellites. And reception of archiving of data from the first digital polar orbiting weather satellite, which was TIROS-N, carrying the AVHRR instrument, started in 1978. So this is our founders, Peter Bayliss on the right with the beard, and John Brush at a station exhibition stand from the early 1970s. I'm not sure entirely where this is, but I suspect it may be a university open day. But I do know from Peter that they actually took this same exhibition down to another event at Errol's Court, which must have been quite an exercise at the time. But I'm pleased to say that both Peter and John are still with us, and they're continuing to follow progress with the DSS at Errol Airfield. And in fact, Peter informed us just last week, I think it was, that he turned 90 years old a couple of weeks ago. Or sorry, a couple of months ago. And this is the VHF antenna. It's a helical feed antenna, which was on the Ewing building roof to begin with, and it was operated from the late 1960s through to the mid 1970s. And the photograph on the right shows it just beyond the two other antennas. The lower one of the dish antennas is a fixed position for receiving geostationary satellite data, and the one on the left, the upper one, is a first tracking antenna, which I mentioned previously. So that was installed in 1975. And that's the antenna I'll cover here. It was referred to as our 12-foot antenna, which was mounted on the Ewing building. It was an elevation over azimuth design system. It was the first dish-based tracking antenna that we had at DSRS. And a couple of interesting aspects of it. It was very much done on a budget in those days. In fact, it was always done on a budget at the station. But part of the azimuth assembly was actually salvaged from the gun site of a Royal Navy ship that had been lying at a breaker's yard in Inverkeithing in Fife. And Peter and John were recommended to take a trip over there when they were looking at how they could achieve building their own tracking antenna for the first time, dish-based antenna. The dish itself, it had slight cosmetic damage, but it was kindly donated by Andrews Antennas, also of Fife, and over in Loch Gelly. And pleased to say that the dish is still being successfully used today as part of our setup down at Errol. One of the issues with that particular antenna was that it did suffer some horizon blockage to the east due to the dental school, which we can probably see more of on the next slide. Yeah. So this is the installation, certainly, of the dish once the pedestal had been built. It was mounted on top of the lift shaft on the Ewing building. And I think, looking at these photographs, you can see various people hanging onto guy ropes as this rather large reflector is lifted up onto the roof. And I think that is Peter on the lower level of the building on one of the ropes. And I suspect John and a couple of other colleagues are awaiting its arrival at the top of the lift shaft to bolt it onto the antenna pedestal. This photograph always reminds me of one occasion. As I said, the antenna was mounted directly on top of the lift shaft for the building, and occasionally we would have lift maintenance people visit the building to carry out some maintenance. They would enter through the door at the top of the lift shaft to carry out the work there. And on one occasion, one of the engineers decided to have his lunch directly under the antenna and got something of a shock when the antenna started to track, and drenched him with some water that hadn't drained from the centre of the dish. Anyway, so that was not the best of lunches he had. This is an example of some of the earliest imagery we received from the VHRR system. So this was a full pass photo browse image. That's a thermal infrared band image from VHRR, which was carried on NOAA 4, and we received that in March 1976. So from there, the 12-foot antenna installation that led to the station being funded by NERC. Essentially, as a NERC facility, the role was to receive and archive and disseminate data from direct broadcast satellites, primarily to support UK environmental scientists with access to data and image products. But over the years, many other users benefited from our services, and DSRS eventually developed a globally distributed user community. The earliest products were essentially hard copy photographic images produced from the data and raw data transcribed to reel computer compatible tape, which was then posted out to users. Over time, the data became available in various other tape formats, CD and DVD, etc. And a key activity was archiving, preserving the data for future studies. Eventually, most imagery and data were generally accessed by the station's website or by internet delivery. And DSRS provided flexible access to full resolution data and imagery, both in near real time and for archived time series. The data we received, we processed to and distributed in standard level 1 formats or radiances and as image products. The image products for the archive could be accessed directly via the website, and higher level product processing and data analysis was generally undertaken by partner facilities such as PML or by users themselves. And for 30 years, in terms of PML, we delivered real-time data to them for higher level processing, and this was to generate products such as sea surface temperature and ocean colour products for marine applications. And that was particularly vital for near real-time research crew support. Just to give you an overview of the sort of staff and working arrangements that we had, this pertains more to the sort of the final few years of operations. So the various staff that were involved was our station director, was one of the academics, had originally been Peter Bayliss, assisted by John Rush, and they had overall responsibility for the facilities. But in terms of the routine operations and daily operations of the facility, it was myself as station manager, overseeing operations, maintenance, new developments, etc., and also as the primary point of contact for users and NERC, and basically anyone else who had cause to contact the station. We had a software systems manager who would look after our in-house software development, systems admin, data processing and archiving. He worked alongside a software systems specialist covering the same duties. Our electronics and RF comms engineer is Dr. Paul Crawford, and we look after the hardware, software, research and development, maintenance of antennas and RF systems, etc. And Paul has been the prime conspirator along with myself in setting up the new facility down at Errol. We also had 3 technicians in total. 2 of them were shift operators, looked after the routine day-to-day operations. The third one looked after maintenance, along with or assisted with maintenance, along as providing cover for the shift operators. And operations were essentially continuous. We operated on a 24/7 basis, 365 days per year. The station was actually manned each day, typically between 8 and 10 p.m. And certainly in latter years, the only downtime periods occurred during extended mains power failures. It was very rare. And from around 2000 onwards, we had UPS backup systems, which would maintain operations for 2 hours, or around about 2 hours in the event of an outage. So this is how the main operations room in the station looked in the 1980s. It was pretty heavily hardware based in those days. We had various reel-to-reel tape recorders, some for directly recording the satellite's received signal, which was this sort of equipment here. And also these were the reel-to-reel tape drives for transcribing data to computer compatible tape, which would then be shipped out to users. The rack mounted electronics included RF signal receivers, data bit and frame sync circuitry, tape record replay interfaces, image channel decommutation and contrast enhancement hardware, and fax machine interface hardware and motor power amplifiers. I've missed out actually the photo facsimile receivers. That's this rather unusual, which some of you may be aware of, upright piano looking object in the corner here, which I'll come to later. So also in the 80s, we installed the first antenna, which was on one of the tower building rooftops. This was our so-called 6-foot antenna, which was installed around 1981-82. Again, it was for L-band data reception, which was in the 1.7 gigahertz range. And that was for the NOAA AVHRR satellites again, which started in 1978, the reception from those. And the key benefits were that it significantly improved the coverage, being mounted on an 11-story high building. It had clear horizon in all directions. And it also supported automated operation for overnight data collection. This was the antenna control computer that we typically used in those days. It was a Nova Data General computer, similar to the example shown right. The only difference being that there would be an operator VDU terminal included in the rack. Antenna motor drive amplifiers were in a section at the bottom of the rack, and control and sensor interface hardware was installed in the top. There was also an antenna CCTV for monitoring the remote antenna. And this particular assembly carried a substantial 5 megabyte hard drive arrangement. It actually had 2 disk drives in it. There was a removable drive which could be lifted out from the top, which was 5 megs. And the main unit below that was also a 5 megabyte drive, a fixed unit. And the beauty of this was it took 2 of us to carry it to the lift whenever it had to go for repair or maintenance. So as you can see, things have moved on slightly from 5 megabyte drives in the 1980s. The data archiving mentioned slightly already was we used from 1978 right through to 91, we used high density digital tapes. So the earliest AVHRR data were recorded on these, and they were multi-track tapes on large reel-to-reel recorders. The previous slides showed the portable, apparently SE9000 model, which was mounted in the racks. And these 2 shown here are SE9000 models. I think it was Thorn EMI were the manufacturers of those. And the 9000s had a complete rack to themselves. And we actually acquired these from the Ministry of Defence. Myself and a colleague had to go over to the west coast, up the lochs, where they were intent on scrapping some of these machines. When we found out they were about to do that, we decided to approach them, and they kindly donated those recording systems to us. So the HDDT was certainly the most suitable way to capture live data and store relatively high volumes at that time. The tapes that we used were 1 inch wide, 4,600 feet long. We recorded 14 tracks across the width of the tape and 2 passes along the track length, which meant we could get up to 28 individual passes recorded on a single tape. And that's an example of one of the tapes. We used Ampex tapes. Okay, for the hard copy photo prints, we produced images for every satellite pass that was received, and these were for local browsing by our own staff and for visitors who wished to visit the facility. So the hard copy photographic imagery was produced on fax machines, as we referred to them, the original fax machines, and these were essentially 1950s Muirhead wire photo receivers. Again, salvaged from various newspapers around the country, and had been adapted and interfaced to the station's electronics. The photo paper was placed on a rotating drum, which you can see on the lower example here, the black and white example. And the drum is inside a light tight cassette mounted on the carriage. And the carriage would be driven along by the motor and stepped at 300 lines, at up to 300 lines per inch resolution, with the paper being simultaneously exposed by the light source in the back of the machine through this lens arrangement here. And the light was modulated by the satellite data, either live as the data was coming in through the receivers or from tape playback. And the station operated its own darkroom for photo print processing. Products and dissemination again, to actual users, as well as the images that were kept in-house for local browsing. We provided users with hard copy photo prints. Typically, they would be 10-inch square sector enlargements from a full pass, which would focus on a specific region of interest for the user, and contrast enhanced for the feature of interest, which could be clouds, sea surface temperature, and so on. And at our peak, we were probably producing around 15,000 of these prints annually for our various users and in-house for ourselves. We also selected sub-scenes of raw data were extracted from the full passes and transcribed to computer compatible tape, and everything had to be delivered by post. So for near real-time requirements, the method of the day was the Royal Mail data post service, I'm afraid. Moving on to the operations room as it was in the 90s, we'd moved by then to more of a PC-based tracking antenna control system. So you'll see various PCs here in the racks, and the antennas were being controlled by them. My colleague Paul Crawford developed an antenna control PC card and the software to operate that. The new data was now being archived on VHS cassette-based recorders rather than the reel-to-reel tape machines. So one of the VHS machines is down here in the bottom of a rack. There's beginning to see less electronic hardware, image processing, for instance, and contrast enhancement was now carried out in software. But the fax machines themselves were still used for photo quality print output. In '92, we installed a 2.4 meter antenna, also on top of the dental school building. This was again to provide L-band reception capability and additional capacity to receive from the satellites and take more passes, essentially. Plus, it was there to support the new or forthcoming NASA OBVIEW 2 Sea with Ocean Color satellite mission, which had been highlighted as a key development by the user community, the NERC user community. And that was actually built alongside an identical system that we supplied for the British Antarctic Survey's Rothera research station, which continues to be in use today. And some of the BAS staff recently visited Errol for some training, because we've continued to maintain our 2.4 meter antenna down at Errol. In 1997, we installed the 3.7 meter antenna on the Ewing building. This replaced the original 12-foot antenna, as we referred to it, but it still used the original dish. A 2.8 meter antenna was then installed in 1999 on the dental building, and this one completely replaced our old 6-foot antenna. So these two antennas were all part of a station upgrade to receive X-band data, which is around 7.8 gigahertz frequency, for Earth observation satellite reception. And the key reasoning for this was to be in readiness for NASA's Terra and Aqua Modus missions. So Modus required the upgrade. It's a 36-channel instrument. Previously, only 5 channels were received for NOAA AVHRR. The data rates were 12 megabits per second, typically, with up to 1 gigabyte of data per pass received, as opposed to 650 kilobits per second and around 70 megabytes for each pass we received for the NOAA data. So the upper photograph shows the 2.8 meter antenna on the dental school building, and then this is the upgraded 3.7 meters, still using the same reflector, but with the upgraded antenna pedestal, and yours truly and one of our technicians doing some maintenance work on the antenna. And the 90s data archiving, again, we're seeing there were general issues with the HDD tapes. They required the manual recorder setup, so you could record 2 passes minimum with without staff present. Sorry, say that again. Because of the manual requirement for recorder setup, you could take a maximum of 2 passes without staff present. And playback each time archive data was requested, which led to potential for tape damage and data loss. And we could only make 1 copy of each tape because of the high cost of the media. You were looking at around £130 per tape in 1990. A more fundamental issue by 1990 was we'd found there were significant problems recovering data from some of the tapes. This was due to moisture absorption by the adhesive binder on the tapes, and the data recovery was increasingly difficult for sticky tapes caused by this moisture absorption. So this increased the risk of damage and data loss and was an industry-wide issue. So partly for that reason, we moved to the VHS cassette-based recording system in 1991. It replaced HDDT for archiving all new data until 1997, and we used broadcast quality E120 cassettes, which allowed us to record 14 passes per tape. And the benefits of the VHS system included built-in error correction, which gave almost error-free data recovery. It could be PC controlled, which meant we could record a full tape without operator intervention. So acquisition of more data out of hours, essentially. And they were much less expensive than the HDDT at around £5 per VHS cassette, which meant we could then make 2 recordings of each pass for backup purposes. Also, the cassettes cartridges protected against degradation and data loss due to manual handling and while the tapes were in storage. So data archiving again, but this time looking at preservation also. The 90s IT upgrades benefited all aspects of operations, including live satellite data ingest to computer, which had not previously been possible. We had to, prior to that, we were always recording direct to tape. By 1997, CD technology was more readily available and affordable, and so archiving of new data on CD-ROM began, with the media cost at around £5 per disc. We recorded 8 passes per disc with 2 copies of each disc, 1 for secure offsite storage as a backup. And also in 97, because of the issues we discovered with the high density digital tapes and the moisture absorption, we began transcribing the entire archive from HDDT and VHS to CD-ROM. So this was to address the aging and degrading HDDTs and also consolidate the entire archive on 1 media type. So this was a major project, involved something like 35,000 passes. Each one was restored from tape 1 at a time, and the project was eventually completed in 2002. So it was a 5-year exercise, essentially. This required significant effort to prepare the tapes for maximum data recovery two approaches were taken. Initially, the tapes were cleaned through multiple runs over an alcohol impregnated swab, and later on the tapes were oven baked first to drive moisture out before we moved on to the cleaning. In the 90s, the products and dissemination, we continued to produce hard copy photographic prints using the Muirhead fax machines and provide data on computer compatible tape, but also on newer tape cartridge media such as Exabyte, which had much greater data capacity. As the IT and network capabilities improved through the 90s, the station servers could hold some latest and some archive passes online. And we began data dissemination to users via internet. The latest passes were available in near real time, and archive passes were restored and processed on request. Near real-time delivery of all passes to Plymouth Marine Lab started, and it continued until the station's closure right through until 2019. Again, this was key for near real-time research crew support. In '94, we launched our website, and that provided users with free access to image services for the next 25 years. And we've included a typical full pass browse image on the right-hand side there, which we would generally see on our website for a no AVHRR pass. And with the archive tape to CD transcription and recovering all the earlier data from tapes, it also enabled us to produce images of the entire archive to be added to the website for user access. And this is from the year 2000 through until 2010s and right through until the closure pretty much. This is closer to how the station operations room looked. From 2003, we had 5 tracking antennas in operation, and we have 1 rack here for each antenna being operated. The monitors for each antenna displayed the antenna control window, an antenna webcam view, data reception and ingest control and statistics, and a live image from the pass being received. And only the Ewing building's 3.7 meter antennas control and receive hardware was actually hosted in the room by 2012. That's shown in the central rack here. For the other antennas, 2 on the dental and 2 on the tower, the control and receiver hardware was hosted in the respective buildings and remotely monitored and controlled from the operations room via network. And the station now had a dedicated air-conditioned server room, which was partly the former darkroom. In the early 2000s, the need for more antennas to fulfill our schedules was clear. We'd considered upgrading the existing antennas for dual L and X band reception, but multiple satellites were regularly within range simultaneously, so it wasn't unusual to perhaps have 4 or 5 satellites overhead simultaneously. And this led to us deciding that we really need more antennas rather than having dual capability on the existing antennas. At that point, the use of the tower building roof had been approved, and we achieved planning permission for that. And the 2 new 2.8 meter antennas were installed from 2002 through to 2003. Again, 1 was for L-band reception and 1 for X-band satellite reception. And it also meant we were ready to support of the existing satellites, but also future METOP and NPP and NPOS missions, which were due soon. Data archiving, we used data cartridges from 1999 through until 2019 at the close. And initially, Exabyte tapes were used, which had around 5 gigabytes capacity per tape. We later moved to digital linear tape, DLT, which had around 35 gigabytes capacity. And eventually we moved on to linear tape open, LTO, linear tape open technology series tapes. For example, two of the types we used in that series was LTO3, which had a capacity of around 400 gigabytes per tape. We used those from 2005, and LTO7, which had 6 terabytes of tape capacity being used by us from 2017. With these series, the capacity essentially doubled with each successive generation. And in time, we could actually store weeks of data on an individual tape. And one of the good aspects of these drives, of the tape drive hardware, was that it had good backwards compatibility for reading previous series of tapes. By this time, though, essentially the tapes became an offline backup copy of the archive, and we started to move more towards online hard disk storage of the data. And this is our first storage system shown on the right here, hard disk based storage system shown on the right, which was set up in 2003 and spanned 3 server machines in the rack here. So this talks more about the hard disk drive storage. Let's say this was used from 2003 through to 2019 at the close. This became essentially the online working archive copy. The first system had 11 terabytes capacity across 3 servers. Shown in the previous slide, it was replaced in 2009 with a 90 terabyte Sun storage system, which is above right in the photo, and replaced later in 2016 by a Dell 390 terabyte system. Eventually, the entire archive could be held online. Products and dissemination at that time, virtually all data and images was disseminated via internet by this time. For example, FTP push and pull and website access. Occasionally, tape media was used for large requests, where we were maybe required to provide hundreds or even thousands of archive scenes. The website was continually enhanced, e.g. with images for every pass and new satellites, RGB color images being added, UK close-ups, different map projections and different search options, gallery of images and also animations. But the website appearance was always very stable, and we know that users appreciated the consistent look and feel and the ease of use and access and the range of satellites available in one place. So from 2002, we started routine reception of Meteosat geostationary satellite data with images also published on the website. And from 2006, we added foreign geostationary satellite data from the US GOES and Japanese MTSat. And the fax machines by this time, I'm pleased to say, had finally been retired, and we were using inkjet printers for photo quality print output. And this was largely for special requests, and birthdays springs to mind in this case, but also copies. Many people requested copies of high profile images that had been covered by the media. These are some of the examples of the website images that were available. These were typical NOAA eventual full pass browse images, so band 2 on the left and band 4 on the right, with a graphic showing the pass coverage. Similar for MODIS data, band 2 visible on the left, and by this time we could provide true color using the bands 1, 4 and 3 to produce the RGB channels from MODIS. Typical geostationary website imagery, left as a Meteosat false color image, and on the right goes east, covering the North and South of America. That's a band 1 visible image. So over the years, I'll run through these quickly. Polar orbiting direct broadcast satellites, we archived 1978 right through to 2019. We had the NOAA AVHRR, ORView 2, CWIF series, Terra and Aqua MODIS, METOP from 2011, and NPP and NOAA 20 from 2012 through to 2019. Now at the close, we had around 40 satellite passes per day received, as opposed to the first decade of operations where we were only receiving perhaps 5 or fewer passes per day. And that meant something like 14,000 passes per year we were receiving in the final years. And we had a 5-year success rates of something around 99.89%, so we were pretty good on reception success. In total, we acquired over 230,000 passes during the 40 years of operations. That's just for the polar orbiting satellites. We had unique archive depth and temporal frequency and continuity for the area. And the archive was internationally recognised resource by NASA, NOAA, and ESA, etc. This is a summary of the archive that was collected for the geostationary satellites, which were received through the new METCAS service. So 2002 and 2006 through to 2019. And through this imagery, providing us with up-to-date full global coverage, this really attracted a worldwide user community for the station. For geographical coverage, this was the sort of general coverage for polar orbiting satellites. So we could see from pretty much the North Pole in the north to a fair bit of North Africa, over beyond the Black Sea in the east, and over as far as Newfoundland in the west, and pretty much all points in between you can see for the polar satellites. And then obviously the geostationary satellites, Meteosat providing both Europe and Indian Ocean data coverage from their satellites, MTSat providing the Far East and Western Pacific, the GOES West satellite providing the remaining areas of the Pacific, and North and South America for GOES East. So the rundown of the user community. For environmental scientists, we pretty much extended across all areas of NERC science, from marine, atmospheric, polar, earth, and terrestrial, and so on. And the largest user groups were marine and atmospheric scientists. The marine support was mainly via Plymouth Marine Lab use of our data to support users, and the atmospheric scientist support was mainly direct from Dundee, where users could access everything via the website or delivered for user-specific imagery. Science output example, during the final 5 years, the stations supported 160 refereed and 87 non-refereed papers. And this would include regular use in Royal Met Society journals, such as the Quarterly Journal and Weather. And there are many more publications in conjunction with Plymouth Marine Lab through its use of Dundee received data. And the support would vary from providing single scenes for case studies right through to multi-year time series. The website also supported many other users with free access to the entire archive of browse images, e.g. we had researchers, including an overseas community, students, teachers and pupils, weather services, operational support, for instance, for flight planning, and public interest support, for example, weather enthusiasts and outdoor activities. The registered user numbers were around 6,000 active users of the website annually. We defined that as downloading more than 10 images in any given year. And in total, we would see over 5 million free image downloads annually. Publicity, we also saw regular media coverage featuring images of significant events, and images often appeared in books, including academic and school textbooks. These are some other examples of fairly major projects that we supported. So there was one was the ESA's long-term data preservation project for aviate data, which we provided around 10,000 full passes through most of the 80s for that. The NASA Ocean Biology Processing Group, we provided everything we received from CWIFS, the CWIFS Ocean Colour Satellite, which was in excess of 10,000 passes again. We supported an ESA Contrails project, which was led by DLR and KNMI in the Netherlands, DLR in Germany. And we implemented a contrail detection algorithm to process several thousand of our archives, AVHRR archive scenes, and delivered detection maps for analysis to the project partners. The GRC project, also several thousand scenes provided for that. That was an EC project using remote sensing data and modelling to derive crop yield forecasts. And finally, even in the last year of operations, we were providing real-time data, VIRS data from the NPP satellite to support the European Forest Fire Information System. So we'll move on to some gallery images, which some of you may have seen over the years, going back to the very early days of the archive. So this is the Fastnet storm from 1979 and the Great Storm of October 1987 on the right. Scottish Har down the east coast of the UK over the North Sea. The image on the right shows Saharan dust over the North Sea, encroaching over northern Scotland. Image on the left is an aircraft contrails image, extensive aircraft contrails over the Iberian Peninsula, and similarly ship trails in the Bay of Biscay area on the right. A couple of images from the Icelandic volcanic eruption of 2010. You can see the ash plume extending out on the 15th of April, and then another dramatic plume on the 17th of April. And on the left here, the UK snow cover image we did in 7th of January 2010. That was probably one of the most covered, most featured images we ever published. In fact, it was on, when I went into the university shop the day after this was sent to the newspapers, it was on the front page of virtually every newspaper on the racks. On the right was probably, certainly in the colour imagery era, was probably the clearest UK cloud-free image that we actually received from back in 2012. A couple of fire-related images here, the Buncefield oil depot fire from 2005, and then Balkan and Greek wildfires from 2007. And pretty colourful Barents Sea algal bloom from 2011. And Greenland ice melt, Eastern Greenland ice melt from 2007. The last couple feature here is a classic Norwegian Sea polar low from 2008. And one of the images that our operators would regularly look out for was the cloud vortex feature, which would appear from Jan Mayen Island. That's an example here from 2001. Some books and other publications. An example on the left, top left, is a UK state of the UK climate report from the Met Office. We also had some of our images featured in the WMO Cloud Atlas, published a few years ago. And the lower two images on the right, a textbook on polar lows, which was edited by two of our regular users, Eric Rasmussen and John Turner, over the years. And examples of some books, including Cloud Investigation by Satellite, which were published by Professor Richard Scorer of Imperial College. And he was a regular visitor to the station in the 1980s and 90s, and would sit there essentially for a week or two browsing through all our archive images or browse files to identify features of interest. Some of the media coverage, so a few newspaper front pages, the Buncefield image from The Guardian, a couple of storm images, one on BBC Scotland News, I believe, and one from the front page of the Financial Times. The lower two images, the Saddleworth Moor wildfire 2018, which appeared on BBC News at 10, and the Times front page from the January 2010 snow cover image. Okay, and just briefly mention the other Dundee built ground station. Ground stations, as I said, that because we built our own stations, it led to Dundee supplying systems for other organisations through a spin-out set up by Peter Bayliss. This was mainly to universities and research institutes, but systems were installed in countries pretty much globally, and I've listed some of the examples I can recall there. So wide sort of coverage over Europe, through the Middle East to the Far East, North and South America, and even Antarctica. And the upper image is not the Dundee Law in the background, it's actually Mount Fuji, and that was one of our antennas at Tokuhai University in Japan. The lower image is the system that went to the Bass Rothera station, which is, as I said, still in operation, and a couple of images of antennas being tested at one of the local engineering companies we used for the fabrication work. I should just mention that Dundee became particularly strong in remote sensing as the station evolved. The university also developed a strong base in remote sensing from the late 70s. And this was very much on the back of the remote sensing group, which was established and led by Professor Arthur Cracknell. He became a prolific author of research papers and books on the subject, including the definitive text on the AVHRR instrument, which is shown on the right here. And he was also editor of the International Journal of Remote Sensing for many years. So along with his colleagues, including Doctors Vaughan, Anderson and Hayes, they pioneered the University of Dundee's MSc Remote Sensing course and supported many PhD students. Also hosted a renowned summer school with participants from around the world. And the benefit to these students of the station was that they could gain easy access to the data from the station for teaching and research. So sadly, moving on to the closure and decommissioning of the station, in 2018, NERC announced funding of DSRS would end on the 31st of March 2019. It essentially decided it would rely on accessing satellite data via the internet from organisations such as NASA and ESA, and it would no longer operate a UK ground station for direct data reception. This actually followed a lengthy review process of all NERC services and facilities, and funding ended for several others, including the Airborne Research and Survey Unit, and the Scientific Diving Unit. I believe around half of the previous number of facilities continued after the closure of Dundee. So proposals were put forward for the station to continue independent of NERC, and ultimately the University of Dundee management decided the station would close and be decommissioned. So at that point, Paul Crawford and myself remained for a period to oversee the decommissioning. Neither NERC or the university had plans to repurpose the antennas or the other equipment. The systems were offered to other, certainly Scottish universities and organisations, but despite interest, none were able to host them. So this essentially meant that all equipment was due to be disposed of. The decommissioning was carried out in August and September 2019. Through this period, Paul and myself had decided that we still wished to pursue opportunities that may come to light for the station, and we reached an agreement with the university to acquire the antennas and related equipment. So our plan was to establish a new ground station aiming to support small satellite operations, which was going to be essential for commercial viability of the station, and to reinstate EO satellite data reception capabilities and image services, and also provide satellite communications, R&D collaboration and support. And you can see some of the decommissioning work going on here with 3 or 4 of the antennas loaded onto a lorry trailer there during September 2019. So the next step was to find a new site, and also we formed Dundee Satellite Station Ltd in July 2019 to kind of carry this forward. We investigated suitable sites, and the former World War II RAF Errol airfield was identified as an excellent location. It's located midway between Dundee and Perth on the north bank of the River Tay. It's an open flat site with a low horizon in all directions below 3 degrees in elevation. The airfield owners were particularly keen to work with us, which was another attraction, and they had a section of disused runway available, which would have been perfect for us. It's around about 100 metres by 40 metres area. This is a photograph of the airfield itself. It's a Class A airfield, as it's referred to. The A being because of the 3 runways there. And you can see essentially we have an upside down A shape there. There's still 1 runway in use, which is the one running across the centre from left to right across the image here. And it's mainly only used on occasionally at weekends for recreational flying. There's a parachuting club that's actually based out of the airfield, and that's essentially the only time that runway is used, but it's actually unlicensed. So any air traffic control arrangements have to be done, coordinated via Dundee Airport. So the station itself, the site that we've got is, hopefully you can see, is bounded by the red box here on this part of one of the disused runways. So the airfield itself operated from 1942 until 48, and the ownership was then returned to the original landowners. It's now a part agriculture and a part light industrial site. Supporting infrastructure, as far as we were concerned, it has good site access, ample power capacity with the 500 kVA substation next to the DSS site, fibre network infrastructure in the local area, and mains water supply, should that be needed. So preparing for the new station, the antennas were transported to Errol in September 2019, and all other related equipment was stored in various spare rooms and garages, including this one here. A planning application was prepared and submitted to Perth and Kinross Council in November 2019, and a detailed site design document was prepared with installation of 4 antennas planned. We started identifying and connecting with potential customers, and planning permission was then granted in February 2020, which was then followed by COVID and lockdown, which built in many delays. However, in March 2020, we did manage to sign an agreement with a major customer for small satellite operation support. And that was to commence as soon as the site was operational. So that gave us a real incentive to push forward. At that point, we ordered a new anti-vandal steel cabin to be used for the site office and equipment room. So this is the antennas stored in a corner of our area in September 2019, and essentially they sat there for the next 6 months right through the winter, looking rather sad. Setting up the site in phase 1, this was our new cabin arriving on site. It was a bare bones unit, which we specifically ordered it like that. We wanted to do because of the specialist requirements in terms of electrical and network wiring. We decided we want to do that ourselves. This is some of the wiring work going on in the cabin, and also the 3-phase mains and water supplies being installed in round about June, July 2020, that would be. This is the concrete ground plinths and antenna base steelwork for the first 2 antennas being installed on site. As with the antennas, these are designed to handle 90-mile-an-hour tracking and 120-mile-an-hour survival wind speeds. By this stage, in probably August, September 2020, our first 2 antenna pedestals were in place, and the control and receiver equipment for those antennas was assembled in the cabin. By September 2020, the antennas were fully installed and refurbished. They've been mechanically serviced, all our aging and faulty components replaced, completely rewired and repainted, and both the antennas were on test receiving Earth observation data, 2.4 meter receiving L-band data and 3.7 meter receiving X-band data. And that's our first pass received at Errol from Terra, the MODIS instrument in 15th of September 2020. So we then had to move on to preparing for customer operations. We installed dual aircon units for the equipment room in October 2020. Our internet access, we couldn't yet install direct fibre. We couldn't yet install direct fibre to the site, essentially due to the timescale we had to become operational in, and also the funding that we had available. But we managed to arrange 100 megabit per second uncontended wireless service, which was installed in November 2020, and that was sufficient for our initial customer operations. But the 1 gigabit fibre service wasn't going to be needed long term. We also had to adapt a 3.7 metre antenna for our customers. It needed support for simultaneous dual S and X band operation, and it also had to provide signal uplink for the first time for transmitting to spacecraft, as well as the receive, and this was needed in S band for telemetry, telecommand and control operations. The dual band front end was delivered in December for this and installed and tested early January. We integrated our satellite path scheduling software with the customer system. The customer's receiver, server and network hardware, etc. was also installed, and then final acceptance testing was completed. From February 21, we commenced our routine customer operations on the site using the 3.7 metre antenna you see here, and also the 2.4 metre operating in the background. Phase 2 of the setup, essentially it was a rinse and repeat. So through the same process with refurbishment and installation of the 3rd and 4th antennas between April and November 21. You can see one of the antennas completely dismantled in one of our cabins, a higher cabin that we use for storage and maintenance work. So again, concrete being poured, steel bases being installed, the antenna pedestal being mounted on the base, and the antenna finally up and running in November. So as of December 21, we had the antenna up to its full complement of 4 operational antennas. You can see in the top view of the site, the equipment racks fully populated for control, and an aerial view bottom right there of the site. Fibre broadband was a bit more of a significant project to deliver on. The first thing was to identify a route to link to the local infrastructure. The preferred route was crossing neighbouring land, but this proved unworkable because of long delays agreeing wayleave with the neighbours. A longer route across our landlord's site was agreed, but this was going to be over 500 metres and much more complex, but it had been approved by Openreach. The other issue was funding the project, which was estimated at around 25k to cost us. We looked at various financing options and eventually applied to Michelin Development's business loan scheme, and that application was successful and confirmed in July 21. So the fibre order was then placed with our ISP through Openreach, but we decided we would undertake the civil works to install the fibre duct across the airfield, hopefully to minimise delays. So this is some of the civil works going on. 500 metre distance that had to be covered. Openreach events, that was completed in December 21. Openreach installed the fibre duct and fibre in the duct in February 22, but the final 50 metre overhead link wasn't actually completed for several weeks after that, basically because they had to replace a telegraph pole which had been deemed unsafe and hadn't been picked up earlier. However, thankfully from May 22, we had our 1 gigabit fibre service. So it's 1 gigabit per second up and down, and it's uncontended. Single fibre is used for that, but we actually have 12 fibres installed for potential future expansion. Coming back to what we're doing with EO satellite data, currently 2 of the antennas are set up to regularly receive polar orbiter data, one in L band and one in X band. We're publishing UK area AVHR images for the most recent pass on our website routinely. And with the fibre broadband now installed, it would be feasible for us to deliver level 1 data in near real time to any users who require this. So we're considering options to develop the services to provide access to more imagery, and it's going to needs software development expertise, either in-house or through partners. And it's also, should we decide that we want to archive data long term, then it would need significant funding for the storage. So a couple of universities so far have expressed interest in partnering on this, but nothing further than that so far. Developing and running the system in-house is a possibility, either potentially commercially or maybe through a not-for-profit model. But really it needs to be sustainable and self-funding. So we think it would require a subscription model for users, which past users of DSRS had actually suggested to us. So market research or a pilot is probably needed to establish the feasibility of this. But as a minimum, the aim is to have a rolling archive of recent images and look to install a UMetcast reception system to add geostationary satellite images. So these are examples of the UK cover images, which we post routinely for every pass we receive covering the UK area on our website. This is the website. It's fairly simple, straightforward. It provides access to these images, covers the history of the station and how we arrived at Errol. There's a blog looking into that with links to various newspaper articles which tell the story also. Gives an outline of services and contact details. And just to cover some of the other recent developments, the Hub Optical Ground Station, known as HOGS, is a collaboration with RAF WWII University, and this was confirmed and planning has been approved for that, local authority planning. It's an EPSRC funded project. So from this, our site's been selected to host the HOGS telescope, which is for satellite laser communications research. And it's a technology demonstrator for secure quantum key distribution. That's a partnership we have with RAF WWII University for that. Currently, 2 of the antennas have been updated to include VHF downlink and UHF uplink capability to support other customers, and we've been providing small satellite operation support to another potential customer who's actually a ground station aggregator. We're continuing to investigate other potential small satellite customers, and we'll be attending the Bremen Space Expo trade event mid-November, which is actually next week now, and we're currently waiting for delivery of new marketing materials in preparation in advance of our trip to Bremen. We're also at the moment refurbishing the 5th antenna, which came from the university. That's initially planned as a spare backup system, but it will be available to support other customers. So future plans: an additional anti-vandal site cabin is to be ordered soon. We need increased workshop space and maintenance and storage space. So that's a requirement that's quite pressing at the moment. And it will also replace the old hire cabin we've been using in preparation for the HOGS project being installed. Planning to order a backup generator. Actually, it has been ordered and installed in the last week or so. That's become a higher priority issue with the increased risk of rolling power cuts over the coming winter. The existing electrical installation was already designed with automatic switchover position for the generator. And we have preparations for an installation of the HOGS telescope and supporting equipment to do in the near future. Longer term, we need to install a permanent security fence for the site to replace the current temporary fencing, but that's going to be the single most expensive item thus far. We're also looking at options for accommodating additional equipment and for site expansion. And this is to offer a service site for hosting of third-party equipment, and it's really in light of inquiries from existing and various other potential customers and partners, both academic and industrial. And that's our future plans. And thank you. I'm afraid we've run over significantly.
Okay, thank you, Neil. It was absolutely fascinating and a really good insight into the past and what you've got planned for the future. Because we've run over quite considerably in time, I'm only going to take one or two questions tonight. And we have a question from Len. So what has happened to your extensive archives? Is it still at the university?
It is still currently at the university. It's not in use. Essentially, when we reached the agreement with the university to acquire all the equipment, that also included the data storage system and archive. Now, our hope is that we can resurrect that. Essentially, the system was closed down by the IT department at the university, and it's being held in one of the data centres there. We had hoped, and this goes back to pre-COVID, and there was an informal agreement that they were going to, before they shut the system down, they would make a complete copy of the archive for security purposes. But thus far, that's not happened, essentially because COVID kicked in around about that point in time. So the system has been switched off, but it's still in safe storage at the university, and we hope to resurrect it at some point. But most likely scenario is that we'll need to partner with someone else, probably another university, to support that.
Okay, thank you, Neil. Just very briefly, with the modern advance in communication, and obviously, it's very easy for any person just to go online and get direct access to NOAA or EU Metcast just over the internet. Do you see yourself more going towards research? For example, when you were saying earlier about partnering to look at the communication with satellites through laser or infrared?
That is part of what we want to do moving forward, and that the partnership so far with Heriot Watt is a sort of starting point for that. But we are still certainly very keen to the key sort of revenue raising aspect of what we do now, and has to be, is the small satellite operational support. That's essentially what makes the operation commercially viable. But we've by no means forgotten about the Earth observation side of things. And as you say, we've got a fairly basic service with latest images at the moment. But we still think that because we have the real attraction of what we have is it's direct reception. So we can provide data in near real time as soon as it's received. Whereas through the likes of ESA and NASA, there may be several hours delay before data can be acquired and available to the users. So the direct broadcast and near real time aspect of it, we still see that as being a key feature of what we can provide. Okay, well, thank you again, Neil. We're running fairly late tonight, so apologies those who are still on the call. But again, on behalf of the Scottish Centre, I would like to thank you very much for your talk tonight. It is a fascinating subject, but it's one that seems to be advancing very, very fast. Yeah. And if you look at, I was fascinated to see the equipment back when the station was originally set up. Yeah. You can virtually do that on a home computer nowadays. So it is something that is moving very fast. So good luck, and I hope things really work out at Errol. It's a very, very interesting project, and I hope that you do get the support coming forward. Yeah, so anyway, I'd just like to thank everyone else who's been on the call tonight and listening to Neil, and I'm sure if we would all applaud, Neil would hear us all quite loudly. And I would just like to remind everyone that our next talk is on the 6th of December, Tuesday the 6th of December,
entitled Abrupt but Smaller Than Expected Benefit to COVID Lockdown on Air Quality and Greenhouse Gas Emissions by Professor Zongbo Shai at the University of Birmingham. So I would welcome you all to come along and on that one. And just like to thank those behind the scenes who are helping tonight, Ailey and Alan, who have been making sure that things have been running smoothly in the background. So thank you very much again, and I wish you all a very good night.
Yes, well, if I can just finally say thank you for watching the presentation. My apologies for running over significantly, but thank you also very much for your continued interest in what we're doing at Errol, and please continue to follow us.